Hi, I'm Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American, and we're here today to talk about hope. Peter Zeihan's new book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, is really a fantastic piece of work that gives you a better understanding of the world. We've named it as the Optimistic American Book of the Month. We highly recommend that you get it. The goal of our show is to try and help rekindle the American spirit. It's to give confidence in our country, and ultimately, what it's really designed to do is to try to pull back these warring factions and give you a sense of agency and confidence in who we are. If you believe in this message, we hope that you'll help promote our show by clicking the subscribe button. You can also share this with other people who you think may be in need or may at times be part of these disparate ends that are taking place inside of our country, warring with one another. In any event, we're here with Peter Zeihan today. He's going to give you the truth about how good we're doing in our country. Welcome to our show, and let's talk a little about hope. All right, Peter, thank you very much for coming on our show. We very much appreciate having you here today.
Great to be here.
All right, so what I see is that folks seem to have this warped view of the United States, and a lot of that's because of the negative media. Economically, militarily, politically, technologically, I think we're being sold a bill of goods that the U.S. is in terrible condition and getting worse every day. Now, I can't reconcile that. I've read every book that you've written, at least the ones that I know about, and I just can't reconcile that with your work. It saddens me to think that Americans oftentimes don't know and appreciate the major contributions that the U.S. has given to the world over the last 80 years. Some of your past books have put more of an emphasis on that, but could you help shed some light on that for our viewers?
It really doesn't surprise me that we have this split mindset. Going back to the beginning, it's been a geographic issue. We pushed into the interior of the continent, and we found navigable waterways and fertile land with good weather. It was, from the old world pre-industrial point of view, nirvana. And we experienced 150 years of economic growth. And for us, that's normal. This is what it should be. And so anytime that we experience a setback or a hiccup, we're convinced like the end is nigh, and we're convinced that our system is about to collapse. And it hasn't been true since the beginning. It's not true today. Does that mean we can't do better? Of course not. Of course we can do better. But if you compare the United States' track record to any other country in the world, we are already the second oldest government on the planet, second only to the Brits. And we have exited every decade in a more powerful position than we entered it, both in terms of our own national economy and relative to the global norms. That hasn't changed in the last 30 years.
In your latest book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, you talk about the significant changes that we're in because of the decoupling of the world. A lot of that can be fairly pessimistic for the rest of the world, but I read some very optimistic undertones for the U.S. If you could just help our viewers understand, what's that going to mean to the average person, to a blue-collar worker, or to a millennials, or for that matter, retirees?
Well, that's a question that could take the whole interview.
That's okay.
Let's dial it back a touch just so you can understand how we got to where we are.
All right.
At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the global system worked. It used to be that you were either in an empire and you lorded over countries or colonies that would give you resources and serve as captive markets, or you were one of those colonies and life wasn't all that great. So what the Americans did is we said that we would use our Navy to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any material or market, if in exchange you would side with us against the Soviets in the Cold War. We bought an alliance. And that meant that many countries, most countries, could industrialize for the first time. That changed the way we live. Not only did we all of a sudden have this explosion in economic activity because of access, we saw people moving off the farm and into the cities to take industrial and services jobs, higher value added, more income. But when you live on a farm, kids are free labor, so you have a bunch. When you live in a condo, kids are just really expensive, loud pieces of mobile furniture, and adults aren't dumb, so we have fewer of them. And starting at different times, moving at different rates, the birth rate across the world collapsed. Started, of course, with Western Europe, but by the time we got to 1992, the entire developing world had globalized as well. So it happened there even faster. Well, remember that for the Americans, this was never about economics. It was about security. So we started backing away from globalization back in the 90s. And today we're the least globalized economy out there of size. In addition, we're a large country with a lot of elbow room, and so we didn't jump directly from the farm to condos. We had this middle step with the suburbs, which are still where most Americans live today. And if you got a backyard, kids are a lower expense than they would be if you lived in a condo. So our economy was never exposed to those forces, and our demographics never changed as much as everybody else. And now that we're on the backside of it all, that is going to do very well for us, because we have the healthiest demography in the rich world and the most isolated and self-contained economy in the rich world. And the country that is number one in the developing world is, by those metrics, isn't China, that's Mexico, and we're bolted together with them. So any country that has done well economically, especially for the last 40 years, you got to look at why. And if it's because of these urbanization and globalization trends, you got to recognize that those are not one-way trends. Globalization is now running in reverse. And that demographic consolidation that we saw with fewer kids, you fast forward that 70 years and you start to run low on 60-year-olds. And that's where we are in most of the world today. That's especially where we are with China today. So we're looking at all of these global trends that we think of as normal with energy and manufacturers trade and globalized agriculture and finance. They were all designed for a world that no longer exists. And that means on the backside, we have to do one of two things. Number one, we have to figure out how to get by with less. Or number two, we need to figure out how to make more at home. And the United States is in a very good position for both of those. Because of the shale revolution, we never really had to worry about the energy problem. Because of our geography, we never had to worry about the agricultural problem. Because of the millennials, one of those younger generations that exist here but not elsewhere, we don't have to worry about the consumption problem. So the hiccups that we have to deal with, the retirement of the baby boomers, the shock to energy markets, they're all relevant, but they're not kind of the bedrock challenges that we're facing. The level of challenge that we're facing in the US is nothing compared to the level of challenge elsewhere, where the very foundations of what makes their societies function is breaking apart because of factors that are manifesting beyond the horizon, well beyond their ability to control them. China's at the top of that list. Germany is in the process of rapidly moving up the list. We'll probably be in the number 3 position by the end of this year. But for the United States, it's an opportunity. And it's one I'm happy to say American industry is already grabbing with both hands. And we are seeing right now the fastest industrialization the country has ever seen, including the effort to fight World War II. And it's not a one-off. We've been segueing in this direction now for 8 years. Would be good if we did it faster.
All right, so I spent a lot of time in politics. I was mayor of the city of Phoenix, been involved in a number of presidential campaigns. I'm watching on the nightly news. It seems like the only thing that they believe we're represented by is AOC on one hand and green on the other, and that's kind of what we're being fed. Do you believe...
I think we should bring back celebrity deathmatch, honestly.
Okay, so what you're seeing happening in the political discourse today, does it keep you up at night, or do you just think that's a standard matter of course for changes that will happen on a regular basis?
I hate to say it, it's probably the latter. Every once in a while, the United States reshuffles its political system. One of the pros and cons of having a two-party system, and our Constitution pretty much guarantees that we'll always have only 2 parties for the long term, is that they have to be big tent parties to bring in that extra marginal voter to outvote the next guy. That means that we have weak party structures. So like if the Senate majority leader is having a problem with the rank and file, it can really get out of hand. But it also means that our political system tends to be pretty flexible, because as technology and geopolitics and culture evolve, the parties move with it, and the factions that make up the parties move around. Every once in a while, those changes in the trends reach a boiling point, and one or both parties breaks apart, and then the factions shuffle around and make new alliances, or maybe voters that used to be in the swing position join a party, or vice versa. We're going through one of those periods now. We had the rise of globalization. We have the fall of globalization. We had the rise of the baby boomers. We had the retirement of the baby boomers. We had the technological revolution in the internet age. Of course, we're going to manage our politics different, but it's awkward. And you add in social media, and every faction wants to make their issue the litmus test for whatever the new party alliance happens to be. And so everyone is now screaming at the top of their lungs at the same time. All I can guarantee you is we will get through this. This is the 7th time we've done this. It's only generated a war once.
So the social consequences that we hear an awful lot about, which are especially revolve around non-college educated voters, even that, it seems to me that if your predictions are right, they're going to benefit from this. We're going to see plumbers, drywallers, painters, all different types of people who are going to see significant lifts to their income.
We've got a positive demography, and assuming we get back to our 2-century norm, we'll probably have positive inward migration again. About 1% of the housing stock is destroyed by age and fire every year, so we have a constant need to churn, and we have the lowest amount of housing stock relative to the population that we've ever had. So the need for a huge build out is there. That's in addition to the fact that we probably need to double the size of our industrial plant to make up for manufacturing supply chains that are breaking and that won't come back. So if you have a marketable skill, especially in the trades, oh my God, you're going to do so well. We are already in a position where a high school graduate with a 6-week welding degree makes more on the job in his first year than a white collar worker does after 5 years of work experience and their college degree. So that's already a little wonko. It's probably going to get worse because the same demographic transition that has affected most of the rest of the world, it's affected Mexico too. Not as bad and not as soon, but we're probably at the end of positive inward migration from Mexico, which means we have to generate all of that labor internally in an environment where the baby boomers, our largest class ever, is moving out of the workforce, and the Zoomers, our smallest one ever, is moving in. This calendar year, that's already a shortage of 400,000 workers. Normally, we'd turn to Mexico for that. Doesn't work anymore. So this labor crunch is going to shape everything. It is a good time to be in the trades. I can't imagine any workers are going to see a smaller wage increase over the next decade.
So the inflation issue, when you look at that,
yeah, that's the other side.
Yeah, do you see that as being more of a long-term issue that's being affected by demographics, or is it a fiscal issue that was caused by overstimulating the demand side?
I will never tell people that printing $1 trillion of currency isn't inflationary. Obviously, it's inflationary, but honestly, it doesn't make my top 5 list. The labor issue is by far the biggest one, that worker gap that we have. Not only is it numerical, it's also qualitative. The Zoomers are not like the boomers or the millennials. They're sharply antisocial. They're very competitive, and they only want certain types of jobs where they're not reliant on someone else, and preferably where they don't have to see anyone else. They want to code in the dark in a closet. That's great if you're in Silicon Valley, but if you're trying to get a house built, it's a bit of a problem. So we're not just going to have labor inflation building over time because of numbers, but because of mismatched skill sets. Beyond that, we have an energy shock because of what's going on with the Ukraine war, and an agricultural shock because of what's going on with the Ukraine war. Now, the US is the world's largest producer of food and energy, and is the world's largest exporter of food and of refined energy products. So we are only as exposed to the global market as we choose to be. And the Biden administration does have some options for severing that connection. That's not a step to be taken lightly, because if we were to stop energy exports, yes, that would lower prices here, but it would probably double them everywhere else. And that would, let's just say, have some knock-on effects that we might not like all that much.
One of them might be the Soviets would win that war.
Well, I'd argue that the Russians are probably going to win the war in Ukraine regardless, but that's another topic that we can get into if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are in terms of what's happening with Ukraine.
Sure. So the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in terms of country's population by 4-1, and in terms of military enrollment by 10-1, and in terms of potential draftable population by almost 20-1. They also are drawing upon 70 years of Soviet stockpiling. Now, we've all seen these rail these photos of rail lines where they're bringing in these old T-62 tanks that were built in the 60s and 70s and from Siberia, and we're like pointing and we're laughing. It's like, it's basically a can with a turret. It's not a great piece of equipment, but it's better than what the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians didn't modernize their military at all since 1992. They've been relying upon ancient Soviet equipment that has not been maintained at all. And then they're reliant, of course, upon imports from the West, donations primarily. That's been working, but it has a shelf life. The issue is that we don't fight like the Russians and the Ukrainians do. We don't do set piece engagements with large scale artillery assaults and moving slowly. We do lightning strikes. We have an air force. We do deep penetration bombing. We use smart weapons to target logistical centers and command and control depots. The whole idea is, if with enough precise attacks, you can prevent the other side from functioning as a military in the first place, so they can't do a mass formation. That's how we fight. The equipment that you use for that is not something you train up for in a month or a year. That's a career. So the equipment that we can provide the Ukrainians with has to be, I don't want to say dumb, but certainly not hyper smart, something that they can learn in less than 3 months. And in many cases, it's been less than 2 weeks because they've been under so much pressure. So you're not talking tanks, you're not talking advanced artillery, except for very small groups of people who can be brought out of Ukraine to be trained. You're talking about things that your average Ukrainian can throw in a pickup or throw on their shoulder and run to the front. That's javelins, that's stingers. We've already exhausted half of our stockpile. So we're going to be at a point later this year where we have a large, low morale Russian force fighting with bad logistics and outdated equipment against a Ukrainian force that doesn't have weapons. There's no math there. And when that happens, the Russians are going to roll. If the Ukrainians are going to turn the tide, they have to do so in the next 3 to 5 months. There are certain things that they can hit that would break the Russian lines, but they're not easy to get to, especially with the equipment that the Ukrainians are able to use. So I don't want to say this is over, but the midterm forecast here is not a good one for Ukraine.
Do you see them as stopping at the Donbass, or do they go beyond that?
Oh, no. The Russians have always intended to not stop until they have all of Ukraine, but not stop when they have all of Ukraine. The Russian goal here is to plug a series of geographic access points that allow penetration from outside of the Russian space into it. So the Polish plain, for example, the Bessarabian Gap down in Romania is another one. And unfortunately, Ukraine is between Russia and those gaps. So when if the Russians feel that they have subjugated Ukraine enough, they will then expand the war into additional countries.
And from the U.S. standpoint, from NATO's standpoint, can't imagine we can let that happen. I can't imagine it doesn't escalate into something much bigger, quicker.
Yeah, of the next 9 countries that the Russians are eyeing, 5 of them are in NATO. So the American plan here is to give the Ukrainians everything they can possibly use in order to prevent a direct American-Russian fight. One of the lessons we took from the Ukrainian war in its first week was that the Russians are not capable of complex operations, which is what we do best. So we know if we have a direct fight, the Russians are going to get obliterated. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they're right. So if we do have that fight, there is very little to dissuade them from using nukes, because from their point of view, they have nothing to lose.
So even if Russia were successful, though, what's your prediction as to what's going to happen to Russia economically?
Oh, Russia economically is done in the manner that we think of modern economies. Now, this was probably happening anyway. The Russians were completely dependent upon Western tech to make their extractive sectors work. We're already starting to see the impact of some of that in their oil fields, especially in the eastern part of the country. And the Russian demography is among the worst in the world. So the Russian ethnicity was absolutely going to die out at some point over this next 80 years in the century. But if they cannot secure Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, then they've failed. And they have already locked in the price for launching the war. If they launch the war and fail, that really is the worst case scenario for them. And I find it unlikely they'd be able to capture as much as they feel they need to. So we are now in the witching hour of the Russian ethnicity. It will probably vanish. Russia will probably vanish over the course of the next 20 to 25 years. Now, if the Russians do manage to plug those gaps and get all the way to Warsaw and so on, that buys them a lot more time. but it doesn't it doesn't change the end destination here.
All right, China. Give me what you can for China in hopefully the next few minutes.
Okay, so we knew as of 2 years ago that China was already the fastest aging workforce in human history. Since then, more data has come out, and it now suggests that by 2050, there'll be fewer than 650 million Chinese. So we're looking at an excess of a 50% drop in their population in 30 years, assuming nothing else goes wrong. So many other things are going wrong. We're going to lose Russian crude from the market, whether it's because of sanctions or boycotts or degradation in the field because they can't get the tech in that they need. That hits China more than anyone else. We're seeing disruptions in agricultural markets, and the Chinese are the world's largest importer of either foodstuffs or the stuff you need to grow foodstuffs. So we're looking at a catastrophic reduction in their ability to maintain their standard of living before you get into the manufactured side of the equation. Already, there is not a manufacturing product that can be made in China at a lower cost than can be made in North America. Their labor is already aged out. The only reason we think of China as a manufacturing power today is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant. You have to rebuild that. That doesn't happen overnight. That's not free. We're working on it. But there's no way that China emerges from this decade as a consolidated power. They won't have the people, they won't have the economy, they won't have the energy to keep the lights on.
It seems like one of the things that they do, it seems like their number one policy is just to simply keep civil unrest from happening to put them out of power.
Most Chinese governments, going back for the long 3,500 years of Chinese history, have collapsed because of internal issues. Because you've got a strongly centralized system that tries to suppress everything, and that means you get bureaucratic sclerosis, which ultimately consumes the country from within. Or you get regional power mongers who basically take matters into their own hands and basically secede from the state, and it turns into a war zone among all these little principalities. We are at the extreme of the first at the moment. We will see the extreme of the other one within a decade.
So folks like Ray Dalio and the Changing World Order, they tend to see GDP as being the single most important measurement to determine whether or not China is going to overcome the United States. It seems to me like that's an incorrect measurement to use, but I'd love to have your take on that.
I don't think it's an incorrect measurement. You just have to take it in context with a lot of other things. So think of GDP like a baseball. If you throw it up, it goes faster and faster, and then slower and slower and slower and slower and slower. And at the peak, just before it falls, it's the highest it's ever been. China's basically been on that upward curve now for 40 years, but as their demographic situation gets worse and worse, the pace of increase is slowing. And I'm assuming here that Chinese data is a little fabricated anyway. That's just how things are. It's entirely possible that they're past the peak already. I don't know. I don't have access to the internal files of the Chinese system, which let me back up. They don't collect what we would consider a real GDP number. So it's not like we could penetrate their information networks and get that number and find out what the truth is. No, they just don't do it. So their numbers are estimates that come from regional leaders who are trying to succour favor with the central government. And so everything is always inflated. And we've seen that now, that untruth unwind with the demographic data. That's how we know where they're missing 100 million people. They just fabricate them in order to get better subsidies. But you have to take into account what goes into the GDP data. Labor force for China, for evaluated economy, is always going to be the most important piece, and they just don't have that labor force any longer. So anything else that piles on top of this, an energy crisis, a materials crisis, a trade crisis, a transport crisis, all of which were in progress, just makes it worse.
Yeah, I know the 1900s, China had a GDP bigger than Japan, and they had a military that was about twice the size of Japan, and Japan defeated them in a few weeks when the war happened. So
Japan was industrialized. Japan was industrialized, and China wasn't. The Japanese literally brought a gun to a knife fight. Yeah, that's how the British Empire did so well for so long.
All right. So after reading your book, the one thing that I didn't quite get that I'd love to hear from you, what are the recommendations that you'd give policymakers, American policymakers, to try to deal with this new changing world order that you see?
Well, let's split this into two categories. First of all, most of the countries that we consider competitors, China, Russia, Iran, They are so dependent on globalization. Really, the question should be how are we preparing for their weakness rather than their strength? One of the mistakes that we made in the early post-Cold War years when the Russians fell down is we were neither supportive enough of the Russians to help them become something better and different, nor were we willing to put a bullet into Russia's head to make sure that they were never a threat again. We just kind of muddled through and ignored it. If we do that again, we will, a generation from now, face similar complications in the East Asian and the Middle Eastern and then the Far Eastern theaters. So a little forethought for that I would always support. Second, internally, labor. We need a broad spectrum training program that allows people over age 12 and under age 40 to basically go back and learn a new skill. There was some talk early on in the post-COVID recovery of rebuilding the Conservation Corps, which is a program that we had back in the 1930s, which did just that. I think some sort of reinvention of that would be a great idea. There are also some programs within the education department that I think are worth expanding. So, for example, the U.S. government will pay for part of your education to become a teacher if you put in 4 years in a school district that has trouble recruiting teachers. You do something like that across the entire workspace, especially in the trades. I can't imagine any state or local government who would find that to be a bad thing.
All right. Peter, I promised to keep you to the 30 minutes, so I appreciate you coming on today.
No problem. We packed a lot in.
Yeah, we did. Before we go, let's talk about just your book again.
Sure.
The End of the World is Just the Beginning. Where's the best place to buy the book? Where would folks go to get that?
It's doing well enough that it should be available anywhere, not just on the online platforms, but also in any sort of physical format. Let me try that sentence again. It should be available both in bookstores and on online sellers. Also,
you should be able to sell your book better than anything else. You did
think. And if you like this silky smooth voice, I did the audio.
Okay. So if you get audible, it's your voice that's on it this time.
Absolutely.
All right. Peter, thank you very much. Would love to have you back on again. Anything that we can do to be helpful to you, we appreciate being able to do. Thank you so much.
Sounds great. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.